je vais d'abord les introduire. Bien sûr, vous connaissez leur biographie, puisque ça figure dans les notes biographiques qui sont à votre disposition, mais je veux quand même saluer Bernd Osnagel, qui est directeur de l'Institut de droit de l'information et des télécommunications à l'Université de Munster, qui est un professeur de droit constitutionnel très connu. Enfin, il est aussi très connu aussi comme grand auteur dans le droit des médias. Enfin, c'est un ouvrage que je cite régulièrement dans mes cours, donc c'est toujours un grand plaisir de le voir. On est les seuls. Mais on aime ça, tout ça. Et ensuite, donc... et mon collègue aussi, Marcello Vitalo Rosati, du département de littérature
littérature de
langue française de l'Université de Montréal, donc professeur ici et grands experts dans l'autorité sur le web et dans notamment l'éthique aussi de l'électronique ou des médias électroniques, puisqu'on lui doit des textes qui sont particulièrement stimulants et importants sur ces questions. Bien sûr, nous avons également Christopher Terry, qui est professeur, is assistant professor of media ethics and law at the University of Minnesota. He's a former producer for Clear Channel Communication in the Milwaukee area, and he worked in various issues related to fake or false news. So, on va commencer par Monsieur Osnagel. 15 minutes,
yes,
because time is of the essence.
I guess I need less. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. In Germany, we have the same phenomenon like you. There is an increase of terrorist speech that, how to say, ISIS members tell you how to construct a bomb and how to use it. We also have an increase of hate speech in a traditional sense, that all this Nazi stuff has been distributed more and more. And we have also other criminal content on the web, like intentional defamation, incitement of hatred, and so on and so forth. So after the bombing in London, the European chancellors and prime ministers thought that this has to come to an end. So they invited all three big American firms, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, to a meeting and discussing with them how to resolve this problem. They reached an informal agreement where these three companies promised to erase this illegal content in a time period of 24 hours. After the last attack in London, it's supposed to be 2 hours, but at the moment we are discussing about 24 hours. So in Germany, the Ministry of Justice reached the same agreement, and after a year, they proved how good this agreement has been implemented. You see the figures here at the bottom. YouTube, Google removed very much content, 90%, Facebook 39%, and Twitter 1%. After these results, it was clear that a statute would come into force in order to enforce this informal agreement. I don't go into details now. What do you have to understand is the general concept of this statute. There is a normal liability standard in criminal law saying if you are a helper to a criminal, you are liable. If you would apply this general criminal law standard, Facebook, Google, and so on, these social networks would be helpers of each of these crimes I described. Therefore, in the 90s, the decision was we cannot kill the internet firms, we have to protect their business model. Result was a new liability standard that give a privilege to the internet companies called notice and take down approach. So they only are responsible if they get a proper notice, and then they have to prove, and then they are under the obligation to take it down. This concept is well known for media people because it is used for years and years and years in the press sector. So basically this notice and take down has been used for internet questions and has been actually, I will not go into detail, by American firms. It was a compromise the early days of the internet 20 years ago. So what is now our new statute doing, this Network Enforcement Act? The Network Enforcement Act just defines the details of the notice and take down approach. That could be done by Act of Parliament, but the Parliament thought it's not wise. Let's use a compliance approach, as it is known in the financial sector and in other sectors, big companies. Let them to set up a code of ethics and let them report on a frequent basis and let them set up the procedural rules. So what the Act just does is that it defines criteria for these codes of ethics the company have to be implemented. So if they are implementing their codes of ethics, their compliance system, and do not apply, then a state agency can order fines in an amount of 50 million euro. That is all I have to say, because the rest are details. It applies to social networks. What are social networks? Just the three we discussed. In fact, we use a general definition, and this whole statute came into force October 1st, and there are a couple of Russian social networks falling under the roof of this statute, so they were the first objects of state action. This is detail. Interesting is, if there is now this obligation to erase content in 24 hours, what sort of content is this? The statute does not define the word or the term fake news. The statute just applies for crimes that are clearly defined in the criminal law. Basically, there are three types. These are many now, yeah? I personally found much too much. Where is it? No, I'm wrong here. Here, there are more than 20 crimes. That is too much, and I propose to reduce it to 5, because I think it's important to start and not to overload such a new system. But in general, what are the aims of three of these sections of the criminal law? What you are seeing, first of all, protection of state security. Second, offenses to protect public order, like if you start to say that Jews have to be killed and hanged at the next tree, or black people have to be shot, then this is a threat to public order. And third, there is also this problem of personal honor, which is in our legal tradition protected. This has become an issue politically because we observed that in copyright, the companies are willing to check millions and millions of pages and to correct themselves if it comes to money, but if it comes to honor, they just don't hear. Now they have to make a decision whether this shall continue. So that is the overall concept. If it is just legal content and not what is called obvious legal content, they have more time. They have 7 days to prove it. The rest is detail. They have now to hand in a report each 6 months where they report how many erasures have been taking place, how the system works, and so on and so forth. What else can I say? What is considered from the politicians as one of the major elements of these statutes is that the the social networks have to define or have to say what is his recognizable contact person in Germany. And it is of no relevance whether the social network has its seat in Germany or abroad. They need to have somebody whom you can hand over a decision by the state. In practice, it means to hand them in a bill to pay 40 million euro if they are not fulfilling with this statute. So what else can I say? I can just say, is this a good approach or is it a bad approach? If you look at the pro and contras, I personally think, as I already said, there are too many offenses. They start to race to the moon. It would have been better to concentrate. This list was more a collection of sections the Ministry of Justice got by asking each minister what they would like to have. There was no deep discussion. Second point, there is this concentration and risk of overblocking. There is no doubt. If you have all these sections of the criminal code, it's better for the companies maybe to take out than going through a balancing test, what would be required by law. That is indeed my argument to reduce it to 5 or to some offenses. Then you can develop case law and it could be done smoothly. Third criticism, there are not enough procedural guarantees in this statute. For example, usually if you are planning to take something down, somebody who brought the content on the web should be asked whether there is reason why they did it. And if it turns out after a balancing that you have to bring back content into the web, there should be a requirement of a put-back procedure, yeah, that they are required to put it in the web. That is so far missing, but you see the whole statute is probably not approached as a concept forever. Everybody knows that this internet moves like hell. It's so quick that you can hardly make a statute like you could do in civil law or in criminal law 100 years ago. So it's a little bit of an experiment, and the politicians in fact expect that parts of this statute will be crushed by our constitutional court, but they hope that they get advice how to make it better by the courts. So there will be definitely a reform. Yeah, it started 2 days ago, but I can foresee a reform in the near future. So this is basically the German approach in a nutshell. Thank you very much.
Merci. Donc, cher professeur Osnagel. Et donc, il y a... Et en fait, ce que vous avez exposé, finalement, ce sont des tentatives qui, effectivement, en Europe, sont particulièrement à cet égard-là, ils ont l'air beaucoup plus avancés, puisque plutôt que de dire que quand c'est sur Internet, comme on fait au Canada, quand c'est sur Internet, il n'y a rien à faire, ben, au moins, ils essaient de faire quelque chose. Même si, forcément, on peut s'interroger sur le caractère excessif ou le caractère adéquat, mais il y a manifestement là un effort qui est intéressant d'observer et qui contraste avec l'attitude qui prévaut très souvent de ce côté-ci de l'Atlantique où on a une certaine tendance à se paralyser lorsqu'on voit Internet. Cela dit, il y a d'autres types de régulations qui sont à l'œuvre sur Internet et c'est le propos de notre collègue Marcello Vitalo Rosati qui va en traiter. Alors, le temps qu'il s'installe.
Ouais, parfait. Est-ce que Je peux rester debout, vous m'entendez? Oui, je suis assez...
L'important, c'est de parler devant le micro.
J'arrive pas à parler assis. Donc, je vais essayer de traiter cette question. On a vu aujourd'hui qu'on peut la traiter de plusieurs manières différentes. Donc, je vais prendre un angle un peu différent par rapport à ce qui a été traité, et en particulier essayer de poser la question de l'autorité qui a été soulevée ici et là, en particulier quand on parlait des confiances, justement. On a parlé pas mal de confiance. Alors, juste mon laboratoire pour dire qu'on travaille toujours en équipe. Alors, on l'a dit depuis ce matin, les fausses nouvelles, fake news dans plusieurs manifestations, parce qu'on a vu que ça peut être de la propagande, ça peut être des mensonges, ça peut être des canulars, ça peut être des fausses nouvelles faites en voulant faire de la fausse information ou par erreur. Bon, c'est plein de types différents, et je ne vais pas maintenant en définir un en particulier. Donc je prends une définition très large. On a vu Tommaso ce matin qui nous disait qu'il ne faut pas faire ce que je suis en train de faire. Je lui demande pardon, et heureusement il n'est pas là. C'est-à-dire que je prends tout ensemble, hein, comme je prends au premier degré fausses nouvelles, tout ce qui n'est pas vrai, au moins. Cette liste est infinie et ça existe depuis toujours. Je mettais derrière les répétitions de La guerre des mondes, le spectacle radio de Orson Welles. C'est un type de fake news, avec la fake news qui se greffe dessus, qui est celle selon laquelle les Américains auraient eu peur que ça soit vrai, ce qui n'est apparemment pas vrai. Donc il y a une fake news dans la fake news. Et là, je vais parler de je vais attaquer mon cher concitoyen Umberto Eco pour essayer de voir, ok, quel est le rôle du web là-dedans? Donc, quelle est la spécificité? Alors, selon une vulgata qui n'est pas tellement une vulgata, puisqu'on la retrouve dans la bouche de Umberto Eco, les réseaux sociaux ont donné les droits de parole à des légions d'imbéciles qui avant ne pouvaient parler qu'au bar, après un verre de vin, sans conséquence pour la collectivité. On les faisait se taire tout de suite, tandis que maintenant, ils ont le même droit de parole qu'un prix Nobel. Alors, ce que veut dire Eco avec cette phrase que je trouve abominable, fondamentalement, c'est cette idée selon laquelle n'importe qui dit n'importe quoi sur le web. Nobody knows that you are a dog. C'était un des premiers slogans à propos du web. Alors ça, c'est la vulgata que Eco appuie. Et donc, c'est un espace sans règles qui s'oppose à l'espace bien réglé, bien structuré, bien organisé, qui est celui pré-numérique, on va dire. Donc, des médias traditionnels, des experts, des compétences, des universités, etc. Cette idée-là, soulève une question fondamentale qui est, à mon avis, la question de l'autorité. En quel sens je vais dire ça? Je vais donner une définition d'autorité pour qu'on se comprenne, et je vais prendre la définition d'Hannah Arendt, qui est l'autorité est le fait d'obéir à quelque chose sans être obligé avec la force de le faire. Donc, Hannah Arendt notamment parle des régimes totalitaires et dit que les régimes totalitaires n'ont pas d'autorité. C'est l'inverse de ce qu'on pourrait penser, mais les régimes autoritaires n'ont pas d'autorité parce que ce n'est pas de l'autorité que d'obliger avec la force. Et donc, produire de la confiance, en gros, parce qu'on produit de l'obéissance sans coercition physique et matérielle et sans persuasion, c'est-à-dire sans donner des arguments rationnels. Ça, c'est l'autorité, selon Hannah Arendt. C'est la définition, je sais qu'on peut en discuter, il peut y en avoir d'autres, mais c'est la définition que je vais retenir pour cette courte présentation. Alors, si l'autorité est ça, la vulgata d'Eco voudrait que le web, c'est de l'anarchie, et donc il n'y a pas d'autorité sur le web, parce que tout le monde est sur le même plan, donc il n'y a pas donc n'importe qui dit n'importe quoi, comme avant au bar, etc. Tandis que quand je parle au bar, ok, personne ne m'écoute, ou alors seulement mon voisin avec le verre de vin, et puis ça n'a pas de conséquences. Tandis que donc sur le web, tout sur le même plan, donc il n'y a pas d'autorité, donc il n'y a pas de point de repère, toutes les informations n'importe qui peut mettre son point de vue ou son information et tout est sur le même plan. Et du coup, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Que tout est indifférencié et que donc, entre la nouvelle du New York Times et la nouvelle qui a été mise par l'adolescent de Macédoine, par exemple, il n'y a aucune différence. Et donc, il n'y a plus de vérité. Et donc, on est dans un constructivisme radical. Bon, je pense que tout ça, ce paradigme-là est à jeter à la poubelle. C'est pas du tout ça, c'est pas vrai. Et par contre, c'est une vulgata qui existe et selon moi, produit beaucoup de dommages. Alors, selon l'idée de la structuration fiable prénumérique, celle à laquelle ça fait appel Eco, ce qui tient cette structure-là est le fait que nous reconnaissons de façon très claire les signes de l'autorité et donc nous savons très bien à quoi nous fier. Nous sommes habitués à lire un système. Là, je mets la photo du professeur qui parle dans une classe parce que très clairement, nous reconnaissons l'autorité. L'architecture même de la salle fait en sorte que nous reconnaissons l'autorité de l'expert. Nous pouvons décrypter le système d'autorité. Nous les connaissons, nous les reconnaissons et nous savons que vous devez me regarder, vous ne devez pas vous regarder entre vous. Donc, à ces moments-là, vous me donnez de la confiance et le paradigme de cette salle, la structure de cette salle me donne de l'autorité. Donc on reconnaît ces signes d'autorité et ces signes sont basés sur une organisation institutionnelle stable. C'est celle dont parle Eco quand il fait allusion au prix Nobel. C'est quoi les prix Nobel? Dire il y a les prix Nobel puis il y a le reste du monde. Très clairement, si un prix Nobel nous dit quelque chose, pourquoi nous lui faisons confiance? Pourquoi nous lui donnons de l'autorité? Parce que nous connaissons de façon plus ou moins implicite. Parce que ce n'est pas comme si on connaît toute l'organisation, mais nous savons que si l'Académie des Nobel lui a donné un Nobel, ça veut dire qu'il est un expert, que cette expertise est reconnue par ses pairs, que probablement son expertise dérive d'un parcours et d'une carrière très longue, qui fait en sorte que nous pouvons lui faire confiance. Je dis implicite parce que justement, comme le disait Hannah Arendt, ce n'est pas un argument rationnel. C'est il nous inspire de la confiance, mais parce qu'il s'insère à l'intérieur d'une structure et d'une organisation institutionnelle que nous reconnaissons. Donc, les États, les universités, les médias, les maisons d'édition, les diplômes, les prix Nobel, toutes ces choses-là sont des structures qui nous permettent de reconnaître l'autorité. Typiquement, le logo d'un journal comme le New York Times, Les Devoirs, ou un journal reconnu produit de l'autorité. J'ai lu ça sur Les Devoirs. Le Devoir a une fonction de légitimation de l'information. J'y crois parce que je reconnais d'où vient l'autorité. Nous sommes habitués à ça au point où nous ne nous posons même plus la question. Pour nous, il est évident, nous avons une espèce de littératie de décryptage des signes de l'autorité qui nous a été apprise en réalité, mais donc qu'on apprend des petits, et donc on sait que c'est correct si j'ai dit cette information était vraie, je l'ai lue sur Les Devoirs, et nous rigolons par contre d'un étudiant qui nous dit, comme il arrive très souvent, cette information est vraie, tu l'as trouvée où? Sur Google. En fait, ce qu'il est en train de faire, c'est qu'il met Google sur le même niveau. Il donne à Google une fonction analogue à celle que je donne, par exemple, au Devoir, quand je dis, ou au New York Times, quand je dis cette information est vraie parce que je l'ai trouvée sur le New York Times. C'est-à-dire qu'il est en train de donner à Google une fonction d'autorité. Est-ce qu'il est complètement crétin? Selon moi, non, pas du tout. Ce que dit l'étudiant quand il dit « j'ai trouvé ça sur Google » en faisant ainsi de Google une forme d'autorité, n'est pas signe de crétinerie, au contraire, c'est signe d'une compréhension peut-être plus profonde que la nôtre de ce qui est en train de se passer dans le monde du numérique. C'est-à-dire que ce qui se passe, c'est que les structures qui produisent de l'autorité changent. Alors, on parlait des blockchains tout à l'heure, je pense que c'est une très bonne piste en effet à parcourir. C'est-à-dire qu'il n'est pas du tout vrai que le web manque de structures de production d'autorité. Au contraire, il y en a des milliers, et même le web ne peut exister que parce qu'il y a de la production d'autorité. Si vous regardez justement les grands colosses du web, c'est qu'ils vendent en premier lieu, c'est de l'autorité, c'est de la confiance. Google, c'est qu'il vend, c'est de l'autorité. Donc, pourquoi nous le consultons? Parce que nous sommes sûrs que dans les 10 premiers résultats qu'il nous donne dans des millions de pages, nous avons les résultats qui sont les plus pertinents. C'est-à-dire, ce que nous sommes en train de faire, c'est de lui accorder notre confiance, donc de lui donner, de lui reconnaître une autorité. Même chose pour Facebook, quand nous cliquons sur justement les informations qui sont les plus pertinentes pour nous, selon l'algorithme et, disons, en général, la politique éditoriale de Facebook. Donc, il y a d'autres dispositifs de production de l'autorité qui se mettent en place. Et ce n'est pas du tout la fin de l'autorité où n'importe qui peut dire n'importe quoi, pas du tout. Où tout le monde est sur le même niveau, pas du tout. Il y a des différences, et des différences fondamentales entre l'information qui sort en première dans une page des résultats Google et l'information qui sort en dernière. Il y a une différence énorme. Ce n'est pas tout le monde sur le même plan. Le fait, c'est de comprendre qui arrive en première place sur Google et pourquoi, qui arrive en première place sur Facebook et pourquoi. Donc, tous ces géants-là, c'est ça mon hypothèse, produisent de l'autorité. Et donc, comprendre le pourquoi des fake news signifie essayer de comprendre le pourquoi, quels sont les dispositifs de production d'autorité dans l'espace du numérique. Alors, quel est le problème? Selon ce que je dis, on devrait dire, alors on est content, très bien, si c'est Google l'autorité à la place du devoir, c'est très bien, on est content, et tout va bien. Alors non, il y a un problème, en effet, et les problèmes, là je vais défendre Wikipédia encore, où est les problèmes? Les problèmes, c'est que ce n'est pas que les GAFAM ne font pas bien leur travail, les GAFAM, donc Facebook, Google, on ne doit pas accuser, selon moi, Google, Facebook de ne pas bien faire leur travail. Ça, c'est justement l'idée de Zuckerberg. Quand Zuckerberg dit « Ah ok, oui, désolé, on doit mettre en place des systèmes pour ne pas faire apparaître des fake news », ce qu'il est en train de faire, c'est de dire « Oui, c'est moi l'autorité. Et donc, c'est moi qui dois établir quelles sont les informations qui sont correctes. » Alors là, selon moi, le problème, c'est que non, ça ne devrait pas être à Facebook de mettre en place des critères de vérité. Les critères de vérité, les critères de légitimation et donc les autorités devraient être ailleurs que dans les mains de Facebook, Google et une autre, Twitter, autre petit groupe d'entreprises. Je pense que ce n'est pas leur travail de faire ça, que ce qu'il faudrait faire plutôt, c'est de trouver des systèmes de négocier collectivement les critères de vérité, c'est-à-dire de mettre en place des dispositifs de production de l'autorité dans les environnements numériques qui soient, du coup, des modèles alternatifs, et là dans le sens pas négatif, mais dans le sens positif, donc pas de pseudo, mais plutôt alternatifs, à ceux des GAFAM, mais aussi, pourquoi pas, à ceux des médias traditionnels. C'est-à-dire que, et je ne veux pas dire que la légitimation du monde pré-numérique est destinée à disparaître. J'ai dit qu'il y en a d'autres qui vont être sur le même plan. L'exemple de Wikipédia, et avec ça je vais finir, il me reste 1 minute 28, me semble particulièrement intéressant pour une raison. Wikipédia a en effet un autre dispositif, et peut-être le seul dispositif numérique avec un impact, disons, comparable à ceux des GAFAM, donc Google, Facebook, etc., qui par contre a une différence fondamentale, c'est que les critères de négociation de la vérité sur Wikipédia sont négociés collectivement et pas par un privé. Ça, c'est fondamental. C'est une fondation, il n'y a pas derrière des intérêts d'un privé, donc il n'y a pas derrière des intérêts commerciaux comme dans les cas de Google et de Facebook. Ce qui ne fait pas des méchants de Google et Facebook, juste que leur travail, c'est de faire de l'argent. Wikipédia, non. Son travail, ce n'est pas faire de l'argent, c'est une fondation. Les critères de vérité basés sur les procédures formelles de validation des contenus, qui sont purement formelles, c'est-à-dire, en effet, il n'y a plus d'experts. Donc c'est un modèle différent de celui que nous connaissons dans le monde pré-numérique. Il n'y a pas l'expert, mais il y a des procédures qui permettent de valider des informations. Ces procédures-là sont négociées collectivement, c'est-à-dire qu'elles ne sont pas imposées par un intérêt privé, mais elles sont négociées par une communauté. Alors, là, je trouve qu'il y a quelque chose d'intéressant parce qu'il y a un centre de production d'autorité qui est public, qui est alternatif, qui produit un modèle, en effet, qui est typique du web, qui peut fonctionner justement dans un environnement comme celui du web et qui ne fonctionnerait pas dans l'environnement pré-numérique, mais qui produit de l'autorité et qui permet une négociation collective des critères de vérité. Après, bien sûr, il y a des erreurs sur Wikipédia, mais ce n'est pas là le point. Les erreurs, justement, ne pourront pas être des erreurs qui sont dues à la volonté de chercher un intérêt, vu qu'il n'y a pas un intérêt derrière, par exemple. Et puis, les erreurs, il y en a dans n'importe quel modèle de vérification, dans n'importe quel modèle de critères de vérité. Voilà, donc je pense qu'il est vraiment important réfléchir à ces modèles de production de l'autorité et essayer de mettre en place une négociation collective qui soit du type de celle de Wikipédia, qui est juste un modèle. Merci.
Merci, Marcello Vitali Rosati. Et donc, on a en fait deux exposés de deux types de régulation qui existent sur l'Internet. Et vos remarques font sans doute écho à ce que l'auteur Lawrence Lessig a déclaré récemment dans un colloque, je crois que c'est à Paris, où il disait que les principes fondamentaux d'Internet ont été court-circuités et on a laissé faire, puisque l'Internet du début, cet Internet quelque peu romantique, était justement un environnement où se négociait, ou du moins on prétendait que se négociaient ces critères de vérité. So we are going to hear the comments of our colleague, Professor Christopher Terry from University of Minnesota. So you have the floor.
Thanks for inviting me. You sort of stole my thunder with Lessig there. I actually was going to mention some of his earlier work on this. I had a sort of elaborate 8-minute discussion on how we could fix this and model for it. But as I sat here today, I tried to incorporate the things that we've talked about here into this. And it seems to me we have a consensus. It's not new. Fake news is not new. But it's a problem. And what's new about it is the method in which it's consumed and then the speed at which it is distributed. It seems that we agree that some fake news has some legitimate power. The term is sort of overbroad, perhaps, and incorporates lots of things that would be considered legitimate political satire. Being from Wisconsin originally, I would cite The Onion among those things. There seems to be a pretty strong consensus among the scholars in this room that the speed and the width of distribution, though, is a problem. But I think one thing that we did leave unspoken that sort of struck me as an old industry guy is that this problem is circular. It's not one or the other. It's not that the distribution is too bad or the creation of it is too tied in. They're the same problem. You have these big players. You have Google, you have Facebook, you have Amazon, you have these companies that have become too big to fail on the internet, and they need content. And they're not really producing a lot of their own content, so they become vacuums for content that comes in from the outside. And I think that process, when we look at it historically, in places where there's been content vacuums in media, we often see the lowest common denominator quickly come out. And I think fake news, as we see it today, is a lot tied to that. So we sort of agree collectively that we need some tools or a mechanism to sort of get to this spoiling effect, as Craig put it. I suggest maybe better than a spoiling effect, perhaps is a flood metaphor for the rate and speed at which these things come out. But I think we've also agreed on something else today that I hadn't really thought about so much in terms of fake news regulation, and that's that we need better news consumers. That seems to be a weak link in the chain that when you look at things from a regulatory perspective, we hadn't really, I certainly hadn't really talked about it, whether we call it polarization or, as Lessig used to call it, filtering, or sort of this give them what they want content. You're really allowing a mechanism to exist where these bubbles occur, where truth is now subjective. We've used the word truth more than 100 times in this room today. But I think what we're missing about truth is that truth is no longer sort of this real solid concept. It's become much more subjective depending on the viewpoints of the listener. So what I'd like to say is that if we can get better consumers, we can get a little bit interrupt the chain in which this is distributed. Craig Silverman mentioned this morning that a lot of fake news gets disseminated by people who are trying to dispute it, which is ironic in a lot of ways, because you take a sort of traditional marketplace of ideas metaphor, that should defeat it, not make it stronger. But that's true. But perhaps we're getting somewhere. I saw a story in The Guardian this morning that kind of warmed my heart. It said that lots of younger people are starting to turn off to social media because of the quantity of fake news that they're exposed to in there. I sort of wonder how good the methodology of said study is, but at least we're starting to have that conversation in some way. Byrne's paper was excellent, and I really enjoyed it because I didn't know much about the NEA, but it's a model, right? It's a working model for trying to do something about this. And I was astounded at the level of stick that the German government gets in this situation. 50 million euros that's a big stick. And I can't imagine something in the US being sort of tied to that. The current US remedies are of course limited by the First Amendment, the requirement that the government somehow be the censor of these things. And that has essentially left content decisions in the hands of these people these organizations that we've talked about today. So I think we consensually agree that Facebook is sort of bad in this situation. I think Google's a bad player. I think some of the other distribution methods that exist are bad. But to come up with a way to regulate it, I don't think that we need to reinvent the wheel. I think the tools are out there if we're willing to bend them a little bit. And as Ms. Bradshaw suggested, maybe we could treat this more like commercial speech, sort of suggested that indirectly. In the US, the Federal Trade Commission and several of the other regulatory agencies deal with commercial speech a lot differently than they deal with political speech, even when it involves political topics. It's not treated as protected speech in the same way that traditional political speech is. So that might be an option. The Federal Trade Commission is doing this with some forms of fake news already. They're very aggressive right now against social media influencers, and they've been very aggressive in the past against sort of native advertising. So there's a model there, but that doesn't really resolve the issue that I think Craig Silverman summed up better than I ever could this morning, in that we haven't made Google and Facebook pay the price for being responsible to do this. And I do think that there is an option, and the Byrne's paper addresses it a little bit in the form of a takedown notice. I think the model, though, should be closer to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act takedown notice. Digital Millennium Copyright Act takedown notice requires there to be a point of contact at a web page, so that when infringing content is posted, there's someone who's essentially in charge of making an arbitrary decision about whether or not that content needs to come down. And the Digital Millennium Copyright Act provisions allow people to recover content without having to go into costly legal battles. But it also does something else. If we were willing to adopt a program like this, we would do something that Byrne had actually kind of referred to. In the early days of the internet, actually 1995, 96, in the US, we granted substantial immunity to content providers that is not related to the content that posts there. So if a third party posts content to a website, the website itself is not liable for that content. And my suggestion is that if we adopt some sort of takedown proceeding, but accompany that with sort of the $50 million Euro stick that the German model provides for us, I think you would see Facebook and the others clean up their act pretty quickly rather than face substantial liability that way. They've gotten away with that. Now, in the US, we're actually talking a lot about modifying this Section 230 provision for websites that allow for human trafficking ads. So it might be the time to actually have this conversation. But the details on this kind of plan would sort of vary by country. You'd have to come up with sort of a European model. You could maybe tie it to the right to be forgotten. There's things about the NEA that I think are really interesting, and I'm kind of curious how the German courts are going to work through that. I think it'll be a really interesting thing to see. But you might also be able to incorporate something like Professor Rubin was suggesting, with sort of an algorithmic approach, where these takedowns then just become automatic. I don't know the answer. I don't really have that. But you're certainly going to need better news consumers and a little more compliant social media platform to get to the goals that we seem to all be trying to address here. So thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Terry. Terry, alors nous avons du temps pour quelques échanges, quelques questions. Donc les participants au séminaire peut-être souhaiteraient peut-être interagir. Alors,
Bernd, is the procedure in the new German law similar to the procedure for taking down personal information under the right to be forgotten?
No, it has nothing to do with each other. Although I should mention that I met last week this guy, what is his name? Peter Fleischer. He's the boss of Google, the data protection boss of Google. They invited me to come to Berlin to discuss this right to be forgotten stuff. And Mr. Fleischer pointed out that they are completely obeying to the European Court decision, and it's somewhere in the webpage. I'm a big fan of Google, what they are doing, I have to admit. I think they have already proven 800 or 900,000 cases.
But that's a notice and takedown system as well.
It is similar. It has some procedural requirements. They, especially Google, adopted, and everything is on the webpage. I should not go into detail because it's a completely new silo. Your point was well taken. Before I was heard by the Law Commission in Germany in this committee at the Parliament, I was called by the OSCE in order to review the German bill. And actually, that is on the web. If you put in my name and OSCE, you will find my study, and you will see immediately that I just copied your copyright statute. And I think that's a good model. Our our German Supreme Court developed a little bit of a different procedure, but frankly speaking, for me it doesn't matter which one you take. I thought this in the Parliament, take the American one and you are fine. But I discovered by working through the literature where the American debate is really extremely weak, I have to be as nasty, if it comes to the freedom of speech debate. Because, you see, I have learned I think even in Montreal 35 years ago, that, for example, if you look to a clear and present danger test, that would be something that would not fall under the roof of First Amendment. What does this mean in the internet? So if you are, let's say, circling around an abortion clinic and then you have Twitters like "kill the doctor," what would it be? Would it be clear and present danger, or is this incitement? And what is the level of incitement? This is not really worked out. I found now this year 2 or 3 articles which are definitely paid by Twitter. There is one lady sitting at the Twitter board. That's a very good article, but you see that there was an interest. And I just saw, funny enough, student papers who were actually taking our point, let's say defining what is clear and present danger. Because to be frank, when we were discussing this NIA, we had clearly the US in mind, and somehow looking for a consensus between Europe and the US, because if you look at my proposal to reduce the whole stuff to 5 sections of the criminal code, we just select these statutes, these provisions, which are incitement of hatred, or where you have not a clear, but there is a huge probability that it could. There is speech, and then there could be some action which is violent, and that is the line of clear and present danger, at least as I understood it. And at least if it is not yet there, one could easily develop it, and then one could even get again Google on board of the ship, yeah, because again, if it came to procedure, we in the committee proposed the Google approach, because you see, the German parliament, me, you, we all don't know how to handle with 800,000 cases, but they know. So let them do, and then we somehow see how we get it better. With them, against them, depends on the results.
The clear and present danger test, obviously an old test in the United States. Legal test for incitement in the United States now is from Brandenburg, decision. It's very specific, and a tweet wouldn't be enough. There would almost have to be almost imminent likely action to follow that tweet. So if I just randomly say, let's burn this building down, nothing's going to happen. It needs to be a likely situation. But then it moves into a category of unprotected speech, and you do away with the First Amendment in categories of unprotected speech. So those are two similar things, but they're a little different in the U.S. system. I know, I wasn't.
Just to try to shake hands, because your solution that you really have to prove that almost somebody is hurt or killed is not really a European possibility because of our experience. That is just for us a no-go. And you see, but you also have to see, our approach is a very legalistic approach, and it really tries to fight against crimes that are crimes via speech. And one has to see that the United States is unique. You are the only country on earth who put it so far. So in Canada, under the European Court on Human Rights, on the Latin American Court on Human Rights, we are in a different playing field, and we have to adapt it also to the rest of the world. We cannot just do it like Americans wish. And to be frank, what I have learned with Kate's stuff, I'm not so, and you see it in the States, Congress does not work. They cannot agree on any statutes since Obama times. And you can tell me what you want, but the structures behind this acting Kate describes is somehow organized. I don't know who is organizing this. I don't know who is financing this. Maybe I'm also now part of this conspiracy gang, but there is somebody trying to overthrow the system like it is today. And this is, let's say, completely different in Europe. We have to deal with crime, yeah, and we have to enforce our crime laws, but it's not that we are attacked in our constitution. And I think that is a difference. And therefore our measures, then for me actually, the whole internet stuff get a little bit differently structured in my mind now after this conference. For example, I clearly admit that there are coming up, Rubin's talk was clear, that there is a constant necessity to adapt society and law to these massive new technologies. I think that is, blockchain might be a minor one of, if they can really, like this detection thing she said, then really it blow up specific boundaries, I pointed this out, of specific legal rules that are in place in 300 years. But let's say this is the thing you go on step by step, very quiet, you do analysis, and then you let first the courts run, and then you see, it's not a new world also. And with this fake news as a method of propaganda, that really a foreign government intervenes in your election, and we in Germany were more concerned about the Turks than about Putin, because we know that they were on a jump. Okay, that has to be in, that is for police, for security forces, period. Sorry.
OK. Je peux quand même ajouter une remarque. Les lois européennes ne sont pas nécessairement toujours des exemples à suivre. Il ne faut quand même pas oublier que les tribunaux belges et italiens ordonnent d'effacer les archives des journaux au nom de ce soi-disant droit à l'oubli. Alors, il y a peut-être aussi un certain dérapage du côté européen. Le réflexe de censure semble beaucoup plus proche. Et donc, il n'y a pas... finalement, nous, quand on regarde ça du point de vue canadien, on a l'impression qu'on est les seuls à être dans le juste milieu. Mais... Alors, je laisse la parole à vous. Madame, okay, you want to...
Oh, sorry. Thinking about the future a little bit, say we come up with all these really great laws to take down content on platforms like Facebook and Twitter. One thing that we're seeing people moving more towards are chat apps and chat platforms, which are much harder to regulate in terms of speech. So what do we do about that, and what does that mean for authority?
You see, I'm now the bad guy here. You see, the whole idea that Facebook, by the way, takes out, I don't know, 3,000 web pages, I will not use very decent language, is, from our constitutional law perspective, problematic. Because in our legal tradition, different than yours, freedom of speech also applies in the private sector. And our constitutional law clearly argued that even the freedom of speech clause applies directly if we have a platform that is somehow responsible for public speech, for this building of it's an open space for open discussion. So if a private entity, like we have now with erasing these blogs, is really erasing this as a decision of Mark Zuckerberg or whatsoever, I'm pretty sure that half of it would be protected under freedom of speech, probably even more. And this cannot be. It cannot be that it is the guidelines of huge monopolies who decides what is allowed to talk or what is not. And we didn't raise this so far, but I think that will be the next project for Europe, that we somehow deal with this. And therefore, I don't know the answer, but you see, freedom means also that you have to stand information that you think is fake or whatsoever, but that is freedom in our concept. You see, I don't like our right-wing party, but they have a right to manifest their ideas in the web, in manifestation and so on. However, there are limits, and if these limits are somehow crossed, police has to step in, and civil society, and so on.
I think the issue with, and just let me very quickly, the issue with the apps, of course, is the same issue that we have with the social media platforms themselves, is that we just do not keep up with the technology. I mean, in the US system, the laws aren't made to be made quickly. It's by design, right? And primarily what you have, so take net neutrality as an issue, you have a group of legislators who don't understand the fundamental issues of these things, and they're sort of making the directions on these things. So, do you want to know what I really think? I think the answer is we need younger people in legislative positions who actually understand how these things work, and that would certainly fix some of the problem there. A bunch of crusty old men doesn't necessarily fix the problem in terms of technological regulation.
If I may answer your question, I think that it's the right question to understand what I mean when I'm speaking about the changing of structures. So I think that these regulation policies are very important and great, but I'm not sure that everything can be regulated with them. And for one reason, which is that the structure of spaces and the boundaries between public and private and so on are changing, and so some institutions cannot just keep trying regulating the space as they were doing before. So I think, no, what I mean is that we should integrate to this kind of policies is what you were saying too. Something which is more proper to the specific to the digital space. I mean, algorithms, platforms, and protocols like blockchains or something like that. There must be some digital specifics model which has to be integrated to traditional pre-digital policies. That's what I mean when I say that new kind of authorities are emerging. So, which doesn't mean that the political traditional authorities has to disappear.
You see, first of all, the EU Commission is just proposing, I think it will take place in the next 2 or 3 weeks, a directive regulating platforms. That would mean Google, for example, Facebook as well. But if it comes now to your issues, and I was just looking at Pierre, this is a typical task to set up a regulatory agency. Because you have a very quick-moving technology, you need to bring knowledge together, you have to act very fast, and you cannot only act by parliament, because the movement is so quick. So you see, it was the first time here, I have to admit, knowledge gap for me, that I heard about these agents and all this stuff. Probably that is a new agency that must go into this direction. And there is no way around state intervention, because otherwise this whole stuff falls apart in different tribal groups getting their interests through. You have monopolies that are worldwide active, and the right to be forgotten, as well as the other things, show that you can enforce the law. You see, the only thing that is at the table, and that's, I mention it because it's of your specific interest, the Conseil d'État sent the right to be forgotten case to the European Court of Justice, because the CNIL was saying the right to be forgotten has a global application. So the French could decide what worldwide could be found on the search engine or not. I was on the Google side, because I was saying, if you start as that one nation is allowed to get things out globally, you see, I found this a little bit too much. My argument is not very good, but that was my feeling. So I supported Google to restrict it to the States. But also Google told me, that was completely new to me, and they told me I should not tell it to other people, but I do it, is that this geo-blocking works almost 200%. Yeah, there are no loopholes. If they do it...
Jean-Yves, vous venez de...
Oui. Yeah, a question for Mr. Holznagel. You mentioned that there are 20 statutes or 20 articles in the criminal code that can be used in the NEA, but you would trim them down to 5. What would be, give us a couple of examples of those statutes that you would strike down, and why?
You see, I would love to go a little bit and see what is going on in the world. And as I'm saying, he actually pointed out almost everything. This Brandenburg case is very old. And you see, our problem is when speech somehow results into violence or into digital violence or terroristic attacks or whatsoever. In the Brandenburg case, it's very, I will not repeat this, he should do it. You see, you have to prove that, you see, the people are almost shooting. Yeah, I think that is for the internet not the right test anymore. There has to be some form of where you expect that there will be some violent action, that this is enough. Yeah, how to say, the standard has to be lessened if it comes to America, and maybe ours has to be changed too. But that's the only way we can find a global standard. But maybe this is too idealistic. But to be frank, Europe will impose the standards. France is doing this in data protection at the moment, and whether this is a sustainable strategy, I doubt, because the US will not allow this, that is, little France will come and bring them their laws. Yeah, okay, now it works because the US is completely paralyzed. I don't know what this country is doing, but if they are somehow, hopefully, again, capable to make statutes and to find a consensus in their society, then they will set the rules. Just a period of time, I hope.
Marc?
Thank you. Bernd, I have a couple of questions of clarification for you. First, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, maybe I missed it, but about the procedure. I mean, who can initiate the case, and where does it go, and what is the process of a decision? I mean, you mentioned at one point that the company would have 24 hours to take down, and then if they don't, they're subject to a fine. But what can any individual initiate a case? And then on what basis is the decision to be made? I mean, supposing I as an individual say, you know, so-and-so has attacked my honor and I want this down, and the company says no. I mean, then who is going to decide that they should be subject for a fine?
The company has to hire lawyers. That's what they do. And then there is an appeal. If there is a sanction, then you can go to the court. I am not... Okay. That's very German.
So it can be,
I will not go into
the individual or the state. I mean, the state.
The state, you see, it's a parallel system. This is just erasing things from the web. The prosecution office will prove anyhow whether these criminal law statutes apply. For example, my wife works in the Ministry of Justice in our province. You know her, and she is just asking, she's now getting older too, so she asked all criminal courts in our province to report what sort of hate crimes, I'm talking specifically of Nazi stuff and violent talks and all of this, so that that the prosecution offices get an idea what this means, an illegal content on the web. You need to have, some cases and categories so that the prosecution offices can act very quick. And that is one road. And the other road is this erasing stuff from the web via the social networks. Who is defining what is a node? Google. Yeah, Google, for example, has already a wonderful application form which we thought we should take. Maybe they will take it, the ministry has to give directives. We proposed as professors, take this. And then these procedures have to be made more concrete by under statutory, by directives. That is the next task. They have not been published by the Ministry of Justice.
Okay. The second level of my question, now that I understand the procedure, is, you had one slide where you presented 3 categories. I wasn't sure whether that is actually in the law or if that was your...
The law.
Okay. So the 3 categories were attacks on security of the state, attacks on public order, like hate speech but addressed to vulnerable groups, and then the 3rd category was an attack on the personal dignity of an individual. Yes. Personal honor, I think was the term you said. I mean, these are very different very different levels. Yes. I mean, I can say I am being attacked personally. My dignity is attacked by something. That's one type of case that I think we know how to deal with. But attacks on the security of the state can go. I mean, this is. This is why people are very reluctant to have. This
is a type which has been defined everywhere, the most precise. If you look, for example, to the United States, I think there is a list in somewhere, this Homeland Security Office, saying that if somebody is supporting the Kurds, the Kurdish party, and would support acts of the Kurdish party, this is also not part of freedom of speech. I've read an article about that. This is also known in our countries. That would be more this category of terroristic speech, where we believe these people are a threat or are terrorists. You see, as we know, we can debate what is a terrorist and so on. But this is fairly precise. It's written in the paper. If you have further, that goes into detail of criminal law, and maybe we have to ask my wife to, as a criminal lawyer, how to answer.
Thank you. Thank you. D'autres remarques, d'autres questions? Je vous propose alors de, si tu es prêt, David, tu es prêt alors je vous propose de, thank you all of us, all of you, merci à chacun d'entre vous.